They came with the tide, carried by ships that cut through the waves like blades. Their names were whispered in fear, yet remembered in awe. For the Vikings did not live for gold or glory alone. They lived for honor, for the call of destiny, and for the courage to face their final breath without fear. Tonight, we uncover the last journeys of warriors whose endings became legends and whose spirits still sail beyond the horizon. The first death, Ragnar Lothbrok. His name was enough to strike fear into kings. He was the sea wolf, the storm of the north, the man who raided Paris and left kingdoms trembling. This was Ragnar Lothbrok. But no matter how fierce, no Viking could escape the fate woven by the Norns. Captured by King Edmund of Northumbria, Ragnar was not granted the dignity of battle. Instead, he was thrown into a pit not of stone and iron, but of writhing death. The floor was alive, shifting, hissing. Hundreds of venomous serpents twisted and coiled, their scales glistening like liquid night. The snakes struck again and again, their fangs tearing into Ragnar's flesh, venom burning through his veins like fire. His body weakened, his breath slowed, but his spirit did not break. Instead, Ragnar raised his voice in defiance. He sang his death song, mocking the king who stood above him, promising vengeance through the mouths of his sons. "How the little piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffers," he cried. Those words rang like a prophecy, and indeed, they came true. His sons unleashed the great heathen army upon England, drowning Ella's kingdom in blood. Ragnar's body was devoured by serpents, but his death became eternal, etched into saga and song. The second death, the blood eagle. Some deaths are remembered not for battle, but for cruelty so savage that even Vikings spoke of them in hushed tones. Among these, none is darker than the blood eagle. The sagas tell of Halfdan Longleg, a man guilty of betrayal and kinslaying, the blackest sin in Norse eyes. For such treachery, there could be no ordinary punishment. His enemies seized him, bound him so tightly his ribs creaked, and prepared the execution that would mark his name forever. Axes and knives cut deep into his back, splitting flesh from bone. One by one, his ribs were cracked open, bent outward, until they spread like the wings of an eagle. His lungs were dragged through the gaps, laid across his blood-soaked bones like crimson feathers. Halfdan still lived as this horror unfolded. His screams tore through the air, echoing across the gathering of warriors, until his voice broke into a hoarse rattle and fell silent. The blood eagle was more than death. It was spectacle, a message carved in flesh. To betray kin, to dishonor oath or blood, was to invite this fate. And so his body became a warning to all who watched. Loyalty in life, or agony in death. The skald's voice would fall silent for a moment after such tales, for even warriors hardened by raiding and slaughter felt a chill at these endings. Ragnar's death, defiant and legendary, promised vengeance beyond the grave. The blood eagle, cruel and merciless, reminded every Viking that the bonds of kinship were sacred, and that betrayal was punished with a torment worse than hell itself. But the saga was not done. There were more deaths still to come. The third death, betrayal in Egil's saga. Not all Viking deaths came on foreign shores or in glorious raids. Some were born of betrayal, of rivalries that cut deeper than any sword. Among the sagas, none capture this pain more than the tales of Egil Skallagrimsson's kin. Egil was a poet, a warrior, a man whose rage could shake the walls of a hall, yet whose verses could soften the hardest hearts. But his family story was soaked in blood. One such tragedy was the death of his brother Thorolf Kveldolfsson, betrayed not by strangers, but by kings he once served. Thorolf had risen high in the service of Norway's rulers. He was bold, strong, beloved by his men. But jealousy poisons quickly in the courts of kings. Rivals whispered in the ears of Harald Fairhair, twisting tales, turning loyalty into suspicion. Soon Thorolf was branded a traitor, not for his deeds, but for his growing fame and fortune. Soldiers came to his hall at night. The doors were smashed open, shields splintered, and fire licked the beams overhead. Thorolf fought like a wolf cornered, his sword flashing in the dark, cutting down man after man. Blood spattered the stone floor. His breath roared in his chest. But numbers overcame him. Struck down, his body crumpled beneath the weight of betrayal. For Egil, this death was a wound that never healed. His saga tells of the rage that burned inside him, a fire that drove him to endless conflict and poetry that dripped with sorrow. Thorolf's death was not merely one man's end. It was the beginning of Egil's lifelong battle against kings, fate, and even himself. The lesson echoed in every warrior's chest. Not all enemies stand across the sea. Some sit beside your fire, smiling, while their daggers sharpen in the dark. The fourth death, Styrbjorn the Strong. If Thorolf's end was betrayal, the death of Styrbjorn the Strong was defiance. A Viking who chose his fate with open eyes, a warrior who welcomed doom if it meant one final blaze of glory. Styrbjorn was larger than life, a man whose strength and ambition could not be contained by his homeland of Sweden. He gathered warriors, outcasts, and berserkers, forging them into a brotherhood known as the Vikings, feared across the seas for their ferocity. But ambition is a double-edged blade. Seeking the Swedish throne, Styrbjorn marched to battle against his own kin. The armies met on the plain of Fyrisvellir, a battlefield that would be written into legend. His force crashed against King Eric the Victorious and his warriors, the clash of steel echoing like thunder across the land. The fight raged, and the ground was soon slick with blood. Styrbjorn pressed forward with a ferocity that seemed inhuman, cutting a path through shield walls, his axe dripping with gore. But the gods do not always grant victory to strength alone. Eric, desperate, called upon Odin, offering his men's lives for triumph. The tide turned. Styrbjorn's men began to fall around him, but he refused retreat. Surrounded, his cloak torn, his body streaked with wounds, he laughed into the storm of blades. He swung until his arms grew heavy, until his breath rattled, until at last he was struck down in a storm of steel. He died not with fear, but with the courage of one who knew that legends are not forged in survival, they are forged in defiance. His enemies may have claimed the field, but his name became eternal, carried in the sagas of the Vikings. For the Vikings listening to such tales, Styrbjorn's end was both a warning and an inspiration. Too much ambition can consume a man, but to meet death without fear, to embrace the storm and roar into its teeth, that was the mark of a true warrior. The skald's voice paused again, the fire crackling as if in mourning for Thorolf, as if in applause for Styrbjorn. Two men, two very different ends, one undone by betrayal, the other by reckless defiance. Yet both were remembered, their names carried forward in story and song. And the saga was not finished. There was still one more death to tell, darker and heavier than the rest. A death that showed the clash of gods and faiths, of pagans and Christians, of worlds colliding in blood. The fifth death, King Edmund of East Anglia. Not all brutal deaths in the Viking age belonged to the Norse themselves. Some were inflicted upon their enemies, and none was remembered more vividly than the fate of King Edmund of East Anglia. His end showed the clash of worlds, Christian against pagan, Saxon against Dane, faith against fury. The year was 869. The great heathen army, led by Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, descended upon the kingdom of East Anglia. Their ships blackened the horizon, their banners of ravens snapping in the wind. Towns burned, villages fell silent, and soon King Edmund stood alone before the storm. Captured by the Vikings, Edmund was offered a choice: surrender his faith and rule as a puppet under the Norse, or suffer the wrath of the heathens. The king, steadfast in his belief, refused. He would not renounce his God, nor bow to pagan warlords. His courage was iron, but it came at a terrible price. Bound to a tree, Edmund was beaten until his body was bruised and broken. The Vikings, mocking his defiance, raised their bows. Arrows whistled through the air, striking his body one after another, until he resembled a living target, pierced and bleeding from every limb. Yet he still lived, his lips moving in prayer, his eyes fixed not on his tormentors, but on the heavens above. At last, the executioners tired of their sport. Edmund's head was struck from his shoulders, and his body was left as carrion for the crows. But the Christians of East Anglia remembered him not as a victim, but as a martyr. Churches were built in his name, his story whispered in reverence across the centuries. Even the Vikings, in time, spoke of his death with awe, for it was rare to see a man endure torment without breaking, without fear, without surrender. For the Norse warriors who heard this tale by the fire, Edmund's death was both a triumph and a mirror. They had broken a king's body, but not his spirit, and in that unbroken spirit, they saw something of themselves. The skald's voice deepened, carrying the weight of all 5 deaths: Ragnar in the snake pit, Halfdan carved by the blood eagle, Thorolf betrayed by kings, Styrbjorn laughing into doom, and Edmund pierced by arrows for his faith. 5 deaths, 5 faces of the Viking age. One spoke of vengeance, another of cruelty. One warned of betrayal, another celebrated reckless defiance. And the last revealed that even the mightiest army cannot shatter the will of a man who clings to belief stronger than steel. The storm outside seemed to echo with their memory, as if the voices of the dead were carried on the wind. For in the north, death was never the end. It was a passage, a gateway, to Valhalla, to hell, to the songs of the skalds. To be remembered was to live forever. And so, the skald looked into the eyes of the warriors gathered around him and spoke the truth that bound them all. Every man here will die, by sword, by storm, by betrayal, by cruel punishment, or by fate's hand. None can escape it. But the question is not how you die. It is how you will be remembered. The fire cracked, the sea roared, and silence hung heavy. Each man, hardened by battle yet softened by the weight of the saga, felt the truth in his bones. Death waits for all, but honor, defiance, loyalty, and courage decide whether your name fades or burns forever in story and song.